Welcome to the second installment of Under the Baobab, Conversations in Community and World History. Thank you for joining us. I'm Laura Mitchell, I'm president of the WHA. It's an honor to have you here in this virtual space and to be part of a vibrant intellectual community that's finding new ways to work during an unprecedented global pandemic and historic political protests in the US and around the world. I'm speaking to you from Irvine, California, located on the homelands of the Akashaman and Tongva peoples. This series of online gatherings is part of the WHA's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In the absence of our annual meeting and the conferences of our regional affiliates, we're gathering together on Zoom to talk about research and teaching. And as a resource for others, this session is being recorded. I want to draw your attention to the recent issue of the World History Bulletin, which is focused on teaching in the time of the coronavirus. It consists of 19 timely papers that speak to the political and epistemological foundations of our current moment, and it provides practical suggestions for teaching in new contexts. I want to thank the editor, Michael Tarver, for his stewardship of the issue. A subsequent issue of World History Connected will also address pandemic-era teaching. Finally, I invite you to stay connected with the WHA through social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can get updates about our new blog posts, which is another new communications channel we opened in response to the pandemic. Before we get started tonight, a little bit of housekeeping. We're thinking about this Baobab session like a talk show. Candace Goucher will be our host. David Christian, Lauren Benton, Jennifer Gaynor, and Matt Romaniello are the guests. You're the studio audience. Please keep your microphone muted throughout this session. And if you don't mind muting your video, that'll also minimize the distractions in our ubiquitous Zoom grid. The chat function is, however, open to you all the time. That's the icon in the middle of the menu bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It's all yours. Please use it to ask questions of our guests. Today's Baobab session is a birthday party for the Journal of World History, the WHA's flagship publication. The journal turns 30 this year, edited by Matt Romaniello, who first worked on the journal under the leadership of its founding editor, Jerry Bentley. Jerry was an incisive critic, a voluble interlocutor, and an intellectually dynamic presence at the WHA's annual meetings. He passed away 6 years ago, which was far too soon. Many of us still miss his human and humane presence, but his scholarly legacy continues to influence the field. We owe a debt of gratitude to those who continued to shepherd and shape the journal. That's Matt, June Yu, Carrie Ward, Katia Tunez, Michelle Loro, and Fabio Lopez Lazaro. Thank you to all of you. To celebrate this milestone, the University of Hawaii Press is offering a special issue of the journal comprised of previously published papers. As the new editor of the journal, with a long engagement with the publication, Matt shaped this issue, putting frequently downloaded papers in conversation with each other across issue numbers, time periods, regions, and fields. His curation of a theme, Roads and Oceans, speaks to the heart of the field of world history. For those who don't know Matt, he trained as a scholar of the early modern Russian Empire with particular interests in the history of science, medicine, and gender and sexuality. His most recent book is Enterprising Empires, Russia and Britain in 18th century Eurasia, which came out last year from Cambridge University Press. It's an important intervention in global history of early modern trading companies, reminding us that significant economic traffic, cultural exchange, and inter-imperial rivalries were not only seaborne affairs, even in the age of sail. Matt teaches and edits the Journal of World History at Weber State University in Utah. He's also currently the president of Fiji, not the little islands, but the Forum on Early Modern Empires and Global Interaction. And he's the most organized historian I know. I'm going to turn the mic over to Matt now to say a little about the genesis of the journal's anniversary issue, and then he'll pass the baton to Candace.
Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. I also want to thank Laura for suggesting the idea that we actually have this conversation, our game show to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the journal. I think it's going to be a fun conversation for all of us to be thinking about what do roads and oceans mean at this particular moment in our history. I have to also thank the University of Hawaii Press for suggesting that we try to do this sort of collection. Part of it was there's been some technological changes at one of the storage places for the journal at Project Muse. They have this process set up where they can easily collect articles from previously published issues, and several journals have been taking advantage of it. And I was having a conversation with the journal's manager there, and she said some journals have done, their top 10 most popular issues, others have done thematic, and I was like, let's do both. So I was drawing inspiration from from the usage statistics, what's been frequently used and cited, and then also thinking about how we could develop a theme that would speak coherently. And Roads and Oceans, I think, was one that really popped, really starting with David Christian's articles on Silk Roads or Steppe Roads, which is on Project Muse, the most viewed article in the journal's history. So I was sort of building an issue around that idea. How can we think about mobility, migration, how fundamental it is to the field of world history, and take it as an opportunity to draw from the journal's lengthy past, but do that in such a way that we could feature different regions of the world that might not get as much attention, feature some articles that have been published that may not have been as often viewed, and think about how that process can come together and will be available. I also have to thank the press for making these articles free for download for anyone up through the end of September. So if you're planning your courses in world history in the fall at any level, you'll have access to this material, at least without the problems of the paywall that sometimes are an issue. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Candace, who's going to introduce the rest of the panelists to talk about their particular contributions. And I'm, just like you, a really fascinated participant in this conversation to see how it goes.
Thank you, Matt. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us under the Baobab. It's my pleasure to welcome first our other three authors whose works we're going to spotlight today. First of all, joining us from what I understand is a bright Tuesday morning in Australia is David Christian, the author of marvelous works like Maps of Time and Origin Story, A Big History of Everything. David was born in Brooklyn, New York, and he spent some of his early years in Nigeria. He trained as a historian of Russian history and Inner Asia, earning his PhD from Oxford. A world historian and a pioneer of big history, he's currently professor of history at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and writing a book about how we humans think about the future. Lauren Benton was recently named as the Barton M. Biggs Professor of History and Professor of Law at Yale University. She is a comparative and world historian whose research focuses on empires in world history, especially the legal history of European empires and the history of international law. She earned her PhD in anthropology and history from Johns Hopkins, where she studied with Philip Curtin, and she is the president of the American Society for Legal History and currently writing a book about the legalities of small wars. And finally, Jennifer Gaynor is a research fellow in the SUNY at Buffalo School of Law's Baldy Center for Law and Social Policy. She trained at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, in the history and anthropology of Southeast Asia and its surrounding seas from the 17th century to the present. And she writes about the maritime and coastal worlds, transnational and global interconnections, and the relations between society and politics. Her first book was partly about the legacies of capture, and several current projects are also collaborations on the histories of bondage, dependency, and their legacies. So David, I'd like to start with you. Your wonderful piece, your 2000 article is the centerpiece of this 30th anniversary issue. It's the most viewed article in the journal's online life, replacing the singular notion of civilizational analysis. Your article emphasizes the trans-ecological role of the Silk Road's exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas. And it pushes us to think, I think, more intentionally about the pastoral and agrarian exchanges that dominated much of world history. I can see why David's essay has been read so widely and used extensively in the classroom. It covered half the world over 4 millennia, and it's still inspirational 20 years later. So David, I wonder if you could reflect for a few minutes. I think we've given each of you 5 minutes initially on what led you in this scholarly direction and why you think this article came to have such an impact. Over to you,
Thank you
David.
very much, Candice, and thanks for organizing this this discussion. I must admit, I'm gobsmacked to realize how many people have read that article. I actually didn't realize it was the most downloaded article. I'm very pleased. I was teaching about inner Eurasia and the Silk Roads, and one of the reasons as I wrote it, I thought I'd like to turn it into a sort of kit, a sort of, one-stop shop for anyone who's getting interested in the Silk Roads. So I put into the footnotes as many of the major works on the Silk Roads as I could think of. And so I included a lot of historiography as well. And I hoped it would help people get up to speed on the Silk Roads. And that may have been one of the reasons why it's, I'd like to think that's one of the reasons why it's proved a useful resource for teachers of world history. Your question was really how I got led up to that. I'm a Russian historian, and Matt, I'm now wishing I knew more about your work, which sounds absolutely fascinating. But I've sort of not been reading as widely in Russian history as I used to. I got fascinated in the 1980s by God, that's 30 years ago, in the idea of big history. And at the time I knew nothing about world history. And I think my way into big history was through the idea that we need to be building histories of humanity that can generate a sense of loyalty to humanity as a whole that is similar to the sense of loyalty that national histories generate. Now, for me, that's one of the most important agendas in world history. But I approached it without knowing anything about world history. And my idea was, if you're going to teach about the whole of history of humanity, you need to teach about a species. So you need to go back to the evolutionary origins of humans. And that pushed me back and back and back into the biological realm, then into the geological realm, then into the astronomical realm, and finally to the idea of big history, which seemed very naive at the time, but I thought it would be interesting to try and see how conventional ideas of history fit into the whole of history. So I started teaching big history with colleagues in 1989. So that took me to the largest possible scales. And ever since then, I guess, I've been trying to kind of do the splits, to sort of work back to conventional historical scales from both extremes, from the sort of micro research. I mean, there was a time when I defined myself as a specialist in the world of the Russian peasantry, not in the early 19th century or the late 19th century, but in the middle of the 19th century. And that linked me to a community of probably about 10 other people, which I felt comfortable with. So I've been moving between these extremes of total history and sort of more conventional historical research. And because of the big history stuff, I was invited to write a volume on Russian and Central Asian history for the Blackwell History of the World. I remember saying, this is in the late 80s, I know nothing about Central Asia. Is that a problem? And Bob Moore, who was editor of the series, said, I can't find anyone who knows something about both Central Asia and Russia, so apparently it's not a problem. Go to it. And I said, well, great. It'll get me reading into Central Asia. Now, nowadays, there's 1 million people who actually have expertise that runs across these fields. Like, everything has changed so much. And it makes me feel a bit behind the curve on a lot of these things. But that's what got me thinking about Russia, not about Russia, but about the larger context of Russia. And to give that volume coherence, I came up with the idea of inner Eurasia, a sort of geographical sphere that didn't define my topic by ethnicity or culture or all of the kind of fictitious communities that gather around the idea of nation, but defined a geographical zone. And so the question was, what commonalities can we find in all the different communities that have existed here? And that forced me to talk about pastoral nomads a hell of a lot. And I realized how little I knew and how little pastoral nomads, how little role they played in world history at the time. So that forced me to look at a lot of archaeology. And living in Australia, the idea of, well, it's Eric Wolf's People Without History. The idea that we are blind as historians to people who don't write about their own pasts seemed incredibly powerful for me. In Australia, that blindness for a long, long time simply amputated 95% of the chronology of the history of this continent. Things are changing now, but that's one of the reasons I was so fascinated in the pastoral nomadic world. For many people, Alexander the Great is still a heroic figure, whereas Genghis Khan is a thug. Now, that simply reflects the difference that people wrote about Alexander the Great, people from inside with sympathy. We have very little writing. We do have a bit, but very little inside writing about the Mongols. Now, I've taken up my time, Candice, but it was really trying to bridge the gap between big history and more conventional forms of research through the invitation to write that volume that got me very interested in the idea of this large zone in Eurasia. And from then, it was just a natural step to look at the system of exchange that riveted the whole thing together. And that system of exchange was the Silk Roads.
We can come back to some of these points, and I hope we will. Let's move on to Lauren's article. Lauren Benton's article is titled "The Legal Regime of the South Atlantic World, Jurisdictional Complexity as Institutional Order." Also published in 2000. This essay asks, what were the boundaries of the pre-modern world? How did the global interconnectedness really function? Of what elements were these interconnections fabricated? And the essay, in my opinion, is just an astonishing example of thinking outside the box about a very harsh era of profound inequality and finding similarities in the processes of identity formation where differences might have been more readily expected. So Laurie, I'll ask you the same question. What led you in this direction, and why do you think that the work has had such staying power?
Thank you, Candice, and thanks very much also for the invitation to be part of this. I was happy in reflecting on this piece to find that I was remembering Jerry Bentley with great fondness. It was Jerry who recruited me to write this and another article for the journal. As those who are on the call who knew him will remember, he was just terribly broad-minded, always looking for new angles and new directions to move the field in. And so it was a pleasure to be remembering him. 20 years ago, which seems a long time to me now, when I was working on this piece, law really had not been integrated into the field of world history. Legal history was being done by people in national or at the most imperial frames, sometimes colonial frames, but hardly ever across polities. And except in the history of international law, which was very heavily Eurocentric in its orientation and also heavily oriented around the reading and interpretation of canonical texts. So I really was very interested in seeing if I could do something about this and just thinking broadly. I was trained as a world historian by Philip Curtin. The one of the many things I learned from Philip Curtin was to be fearless about jumping into literatures you don't know. And so I was really going into a lot of new material as I thought about these things. So as I look back on the article and reread it, I'm gratified, I guess I would say, to see, first of all, I seem to be rather smart then. I think my intelligence may have deteriorated since then. But I was gratified also to see that there are multiple strands. I wanted to signal 4 of them that I think have continued on over the last 2 decades and really flourished as we have, in effect, invented a new field that I would call global legal history. That, as I said, I just don't think it existed 2 decades ago. And it has many facets and is really a robust field. So I want to signal a couple of perspectives that come out in the article that persist. One is a perspective that I'm rather fond of and it translates sometimes into a methodological approach, and that is a focus on jurisdictional politics. And it is the insight at the heart of this article is that early modern polities were all multi-jurisdictional. That meant people as legal actors were very familiar with jurisdictional jockeying and jurisdictional tensions. And this actually allowed them or facilitated them to move into societies that we would, in our older framework, tend to think of as just legally very different. But they had this kind of capacity to draw analogies as they entered these multi-jurisdictional worlds that were, full of these conflicts. Then kind of cognate insight is that you can look methodologically for these clusters of jurisdictional conflicts. And often as these clusters reproduce themselves in similar ways across polities, they help us to identify institutional shifts in global order. So that kind of framework of jurisdictional politics has since been taken up, I'm happy to say, by other scholars and has produced a lot of very good histories. A second framework or perspective, it has to do with the legal pluralism of empires. And again, this multi-jurisdictional quality, but with a special focus on the impact of empires on world history. And of course, I don't need to summarize for everyone here how influential the imperial turn has been in world history, but I do think that the kind of legal and institutional perspective has been a big part of this turn. I can't even name all of them. Some of them are on this call, people who have contributed in very important ways to this: Kerry Ward, Alan Karras, my former colleagues at NYU, Jane Burbank and Fred Cooper. So there's this robust attention to the kind of global effects of, again, rather similar tensions and conflicts and patterns of legal change that have taken place inside empires. And then the third is also dear to my heart. You can sort of see the seeds of it here. And that is how do we address the question, and global historians have started to work very hard on this, of how we characterize the history of international law in a way that is not so Eurocentric, that encompasses regions and polities outside Europe. And here, this kind of search for patterns of legal practice from which we then identify kind of categories of legal interactions or legal processes, sort of emerges as an alternative way of writing the history of global law and of the kind of early international law avant la lettre. And that too has continued. There are many sub-parts of this that are quite interesting, including having the a recent focus on interpolity regions and how they are constructed through and around legal interactions. And then finally, I'm almost out of time. I probably am out of time. I'll just mention that, of course, a good part of this article is about legalities of captivity, and also Atlantic world is in the title. I think we have now moved to a sort of more global approach to all the themes that are in this article. But there is, I think, a very important connection between these approaches and what has come to be a very dynamic literature on Atlantic slavery and captivity as a legal regime, as an interpolity legal regime. And again, you know, the kind of older approach that we had to draw on in 2000 was to the extent that it was comparative, it was kind of comparative in fairly old-fashioned ways, contrasting Iberian slavery to British and North American slavery, for example, and really the field of law and slavery has gone pretty wild, and even, I would say, even just in the last 5 years, there have been a tremendous number of very important books and articles that contribute to building this notion of a legal regime that is much bigger than any particular polity or society. So it was fun for me to reread this thing, and I hope still useful for others. But the main point I would want to make is that really in the last 2 decades, we've come from essentially no field of global legal history to a very, very vibrant field of global legal history in a short period of time. So it's been pretty exciting to be a part of that.
Thank you. So finally, the third essay was written by Jennifer Gaynor, and it is titled Ages of Sail, Ocean Basins, and Southeast Asia. It's a wonderful essay, which also, I think, orients us away from our terracentrism to connections via Oceania, not only the early Ming imperial fleets in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, but also Southeast Asian, Indian Ocean voyages that predate European maritime encounters. It's more recent. It was published in 2013, but 7 years later, we can say that world historians are still explorers of its uncharted waters. I think especially in consideration of a wonderful point that gets made of this fluctuating insularity and expansive interactions the article describes. So Jennifer Gaynor, what led your scholarship in this incredibly rich direction? And what do you think accounts for the staying power of your research?
Thank you, Candice, for the introduction, and thanks to everybody for coming to this event. Ages of Sail, Ocean Basins, and Southeast Asia was originally drafted for a wonderful maritime history conference at the University of British Columbia, organized by the late Danny Vickers, who, along with Jerry Bentley, is sorely missed. And it was encouraged, publication was encouraged not only by Jerry, but by, you know, luminaries in maritime history who were part of the conference, Paul Darcy, Michael Pearson, John Gillis, Marcus Rediker. And while the conference provided an occasion to articulate its main ideas, the article also grew out of my own need to kind of clear the decks intellectually for my book, Intertidal History in Island Southeast Asia, along with other articles. I just had to kind of eke out the space. I had to clear out certain ideas. So in Ages of Sail, what I did was I juxtaposed the European Age of Sail with 2 other preceding moments during which long-distance voyaging flowered from mainland Asia, as well as in the Pacific, which took me on a David, you were talking about engaging literatures you weren't completely familiar with, to put it mildly. I delved very deeply into the archaeological record of the Pacific to understand this kind of period of long distance voyaging, because the records on the Pacific for historians are, you know, the written records are almost non-existent, except going back to European sort of encounters there. So it was a very interesting adventure for me, since I was trained as an anthropologist, but not, you know, as an archaeologist in particular. And what led me to that actually was teaching world history, the kind of earlier period, not quite as early as David gets, but specializing a course in world history on maritime histories of the globe led me into this literature, and then I went further with it. So these two 15th century cases relativized the European accomplishment of an age of sail. So in some ways, the article was a very straightforward critique of Eurocentrism. Yet since each case also extended into and overlapped with Southeast Asia, I used the article to foreground how the region's maritime space was depicted in the historiography, and to discuss the limits, actually, as Jerry Bentley had also done, of an ocean basin's approach to, in this case, maritime Southeast Asia's past. I was reluctant. I felt kind of pressures forming in different parts of transnational history, world history. And I was reluctant to fall into the potential trap of simply subsuming Southeast Asia's maritime history into Indian Ocean history or Pacific history. And the article illustrated how these other examples of maritime efflorescence were entangled in Southeast Asia with its extensive coastlines and archipelagos and its port polities and hinterseas. Yet the piece also showed the limits of an ocean basin's approach by de-emphasizing geographic categories in favor of underscoring the very long histories of maritime practices in Southeast Asia and between it and the surrounding oceans. So this focus on maritime practices, I think it really frees one up and freed me up, I think, to look, as it were, from the other boats. In other words, not just from the decks of colonial ships, and allows one to examine how maritime and coastal environments helped shape both social and political structures, as well as the everyday textures of history in such places. So what accounts for its staying power? I think it actually remains to be seen whether this article really has staying power. But one thing that suggests it may is the increase over recent years in the number of conferences and publications, respectively on the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, or focused more on each of those, that also really want to include interactions with Southeast Asia without simply subsuming it, or for that matter, skipping over it as though there were a cultural dead zone through which direct links ran between India and China. But I actually want to suggest another way in which the article has staying power. Its title, Ages of Sail, embodies much more than a critique of Eurocentrism and an implicit call, for the importance of mining a range of sources in both colonial archives, vernaculars, and through other methodologies, including archaeological ones. Sure, Ages of Sail illustrates a plurality, but not just one about different perspectives. I think rather more Brodelian and structural in intent. Ages of Sail signals the importance of nautical revolutions. We've come to recognize the importance of agricultural revolutions for world history. But as I'm sure some of you have noticed, the world isn't green, it's blue, right? So just as the agricultural revolution was multiple and varied in its manifestations, the nautical revolutions behind these ages of sail similarly seeded major changes in social complexity, that is, in the structured production of social hierarchies, with profound impacts on the globe's islands and coastal societies and their interactions, and on mariners' abilities to help forge all sorts of communication links across different scales of time and place. So these nautical revolutions, I think, that undergird different ages of sail account for any staying power that the article may have in world history.
Thank you. Thank you. So I want to remind the audience of participants that we are going to welcome their comments and questions in about 15 or 20 minutes from now. So please jump in virtually. Start sending us questions via the chat function on Zoom. Don't be shy. We want you to participate. For now, I will kick off the discussion by asking our three, what seem to be very fearless scholars. I want to ask, why is world history important today? We've all spent the last few months in our separate bunkers, contemplating the meaning of life. Perhaps occasionally we've asked ourselves about the ways that world history can contribute to meaningful conversations about the past that have a bearing on the most pressing crises of the current moment. And I mean, pick your crisis: global racism, inequality, immigration, global pandemics, dueling versions of history, the planetary perils of global warming. Why does world history matter? Anyone can jump in.
I'll have a go. I've sort of tried an answer already. When I was a graduate, the idea of world history seemed radical and very strange. And I guess the attempts to go beyond a national framework were dominated by civilizational histories, Toynbee type histories. Well, one of Toynbee's researchers, Bill McNeill, was one of the people who really broke through that idea and showed the importance of breaking down the borders, not treating civilizations as having rigid borders. So increasingly the idea of interconnections became a central theme in world history. And I think I'm very much in that tradition. There's an article by David Northrop which periodizes world history over 200,000 years, very simply into two parts. There's everything that happened before 1,000 years ago, and then there's the rest. Before 1,000 years ago, we have a story of divergence. After 1,000 years, it's a story of convergence. Now, of course, the convergence began well before 1,000 years ago, but his point is that there's a sort of tipping point then. And for me, that really rings true. The idea that as a species, one of the dominant things that makes us so different from every species that's existed in 4 billion years is our capacity to change our behavior across generations, which is really, really unique. Most other species don't have that ability. And we can do it because we can talk, we can exchange ideas. So one of the ways of looking at human history is to see a long, long period in which human history was a history of thousands of rather small communities that had very important links with local communities, in which goods could be exchanged over large areas, but in which the crucial communities really were the local communities, and local communities of maybe just a few tens of people or a few hundred people. Then since I more and more think the agricultural revolution really is a critical turning point. From then onwards, we found larger communities that are more interconnected, so that this process of tracking the expansion of the networks that link human beings is for me one of the central themes of world history. Those networks generated more and more powerful technologies, and they help explain why eventually, from the 16th century, the networks became global, and they became more and more powerful until today we dominate a biosphere. And this is a sort of turning point in the history of planet Earth. There's a single species that dominates a biosphere. Will it take on that job well, with some grace, some skill, some ethics, or will it mess it up? That's the big question that faces us. So now we're a united species. We're a globally linked species. And at each stage in this process of building larger communities, we've had senses of identity that associate us with communities. National histories are the latest form of this. The national identity still, I think, dominates historical thinking and historical scholarship. And we desperately need to be creating a sense of global identity, of human identity, as we engage with problems that will have to be solved by humanity as a whole. That, for me, is the agenda, crucial agenda for world history in the coming era, to do what national historians did, create a powerful sense of identity as humans, sharing common problems, common challenges, and stressing the commonalities between us all, rather than the differences that national histories inevitably, by their very nature, focus on. Enough.
So I'm going to jump in here to give a pretty different answer. I'll try to be brief, but you know, what excites me about world history, I think it makes a case for it being essential, is that I see it as generative of social theory in very important ways. And I think actually we haven't yet, since it's a relatively new field in so many ways, we haven't yet kind of taken the measure of all of the ways that it is generative. But just to, you know, throw out sort of big social theoretical problems that we can instantly recognize world history as being revelatory in relation to. The way power and difference work together, how we theorize the relationship between power and difference, the relation and difference between the natural world and the human. And of course, the kind of central problem of agency and structure, which is, you know, a problem that almost everybody writing world history that is immersed in the history of a particular place has to grapple with. This, the degree to which your local venue about which you know so much, it can tell you something about larger structures and the degree to which larger structures are having an impact on locality. So I just think that it's incredibly fruitful and generative in regard to social theory in ways that I think are still a little bit under appreciated. So I hope the next generation makes more of that.
Just to jump in, I guess I would agree that the peril of the planet has to remain front and center, no matter how we address that through David's suggestion of creating a global identity. But the problem is with that, you know, as much as you might, or one might try to do it, or lots of people might try to do it, you know, the generation of social differences and inequalities doesn't happen like through that kind of intentionality a lot of the time, right? So, and I think that these questions about how systemic inequalities get produced and reproduced and dismantled is a question that, you know, I think world history and social history have to keep kind of being connected in various ways, and not necessarily through just national lenses. I agree that it's a you know, kind of damaging approach, but you know, it's just extraordinary how it's nothing new, but we're very familiar with it right now, how things like abuses of power are alternately flaunted and normalized, as well as hidden and silenced. But the ways in which that happened and the axes of meaning through which those things are affected, it differs from place to place and time. So I guess I think world history has the benefit of showing us different ways that people resolve and make conflict, but at the same time, they show us the sort of structures and systems that we're linked in. And I think the biggest, most important part of world history is to kind of work against Eurocentrism and American exceptionalism.
David, Wikipedia tells me that you made a prediction about 10 years ago that over the next 50 years that we would see a return of the ancient tradition of universal history, a new form of universal history that would be global in its practice and scientific in its methods. Is big history this turn to a universal history?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I think it is. I have my worries about the phrase big history. It was cute when I first coined it. It's not necessarily the best way of describing it, but I've also, just as I think that we need to explore problems of inequality, of identity, of power relations, within a global rather than a national framework, which is, I think, something all world historians are working on. I also have felt very, very strongly that we need to integrate different forms of knowledge in powerful ways. Now, one way of defining history is simply as knowledge of the past. Now, if history is knowledge of the past, and if knowledge of the past helps us understand the present, then the kind of practical limits to research on the past within the history profession, we research still overwhelmingly the past of human beings that left records. The history of the people of Woolf's people without history is still grossly underwritten. Why stay with humans? As we're realizing together, we should be looking at coronavirus as well, to other species, because they're part of our existence. We're having a huge impact on them. So the idea of a history that embraces the whole of the past seems to me an incredibly important project, and one which I think has power to illuminate what we do as conventionally as historians. But the other crucial aspect of it is something that E.O. Wilson's argued for years, that research in the last 100 years within specialist disciplines has been colossally successful, colossally. So successful, in fact, that now the kind of intellectual deserts are regions that lie between disciplines. So the project of trying to build bridges between disciplines all the way from history to cosmology seems to me profoundly important, because I think there are huge synergies out there. And that's why one of the reasons I still remain very enthusiastic about the idea of big history.
Well, I'm old enough to remember the impact of something we called the radiocarbon revolution.
Oh, absolutely.
And its impact on history, where the development of a dating technique based on the decay of carbon-14 isotopes suddenly made it possible to make comparative statements that had some validity. And scientific dating muddied the waters for people who wanted to believe that Africans had no history, that everything significant had happened first in Europe. And we were able to debunk many of those myths. But I wonder if we don't have another silent revolution right now, maybe brought about by genetics and the understanding and mapping of the genome, genetic testing and the application of genetic research. Is all of that changing the way we do history? Is science maybe once again reshaping the questions that we can ask as historians? Jennifer, I know that it's just recently genetic evidence has been used to rethink the dating of connections in Oceania and in the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting about the Pacific, the population, what was once population ecology has kind of turned into, and largely focused on humans, has turned into a very fine-tuned genetic study of not just people, but all kinds of plant and animal matter that have traveled in different places, and tracking that. So that's a very, very interesting area. So I couldn't help but laugh. Scientific dating's taken on like a completely it's kind of a joke, but anyway, you know, AI and the use of like Match.com or something. But I think that I guess the big history is so amazingly important, but at the same time, you know, even the likes of Neil deGrasse Tyson will be the first to say what we know about the universe is partly based on, you know, where we're looking from. And if we change the angle of where we're looking from, we will come up with different theorems about what exactly is going on and what things look like. So, you know, the perspective has theoretical implications, not just sort of point of view implications. And I think that that's fascinating coming from someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who shares your cosmological history, and David.
So I can come in here to say, and I can only say this because I'm on a panel with David and Jennifer, that I can leave it to others to do big history. And I'm going to put in a word for small big history, because I think that there are just so many questions that remain to be analyzed. And I don't want to give people the sense that they have to go in this direction of multidisciplinarity even, although I'm fairly multidisciplinary kind of scholar myself, but to ask and answer interesting questions. I was on a panel some years ago about Jeffrey Parker's book on the Little Ice Age in world history. And somebody in the audience said to him, you know, is this what you have to do to do world history? You had this team of researchers, and you had translators, and you had somebody who's fluent in Japanese reading the Japanese records, and you had, you know, somebody who could read tree rings doing the, you know, is this what you need, this big, you know, multi-funding and all of these folks working as a team? And Jeffrey Parker said, yeah, that's pretty much what you need. And I almost fell off my chair, and then I decided it would be churlish to say it, but I'm not gonna let that opportunity go by this time, because I really do want to say that there are so many interesting questions that we can approach that will open up new perspectives that and some of them don't even require more than, you know, a modicum of language skills, because we've just got, you know, we're in a great place. There is nothing there's nothing boring happening in this field, but I really don't want to exhort people to do, you know, big history all the time, because there's a lot else to attack, and I often say if I'd wanted to predict the future, I would have become a political scientist. But the pleasure of being a historian is that I don't have to predict the future. And I'm extremely skeptical of universalism. This, of course, is something that happens if you study law, and legal theory. You can point to, you know, enormous universalist projects throughout history that are, you know, full of holes and problems. So I'm going to be the skeptical voice and the advocate of small big history here.
Lauren, can I push back on that one? First, I would never say that everyone has to do big history. I'm gobsmacked at the idea that writing about big history is taken by some people as a kind of instruction to do big history. It fascinates me. I think it's important. I would never demand other people do it. There are so many levels of history. Second, what draws me to it is the possible synergies, huge possible synergies. I think they have the capacity, potential to illuminate history at many, many different levels. I found this over and over again in my own work. Third, the fact that universal histories of the late 19th century have a bad track record is an argument for doing the thing better. It's not a guarantee that every time you try to embrace very large scales in both time and space, it's not a guarantee you'll end up with bad results. I feel very strongly that the Enlightenment project of using science to link knowledge from many, many different spheres, all the way from cosmology to physics to human history, remains alive. It's been done badly, but then frankly, microhistory can be done badly. This is an argument for universal history, in my view. Let's do it well. Let's do it genuinely scientifically, without the agendas of late 19th century universal historians, which I agree completely, generated some pretty warped history. That's my pushback.
Yeah, so the theme of one of the themes of the issue overall has to do with migrations and roads and oceans and moving across large regions. We have some questions coming in, this one from Jonathan Reynolds. One of the themes that is coming out of the presentations is the role of world history in challenging and complicating established borders, be they geographical or disciplinary. What borders would the presenters like to see the next generation of world historians engage and challenge?
You know, whatever border it is, I hope that the endeavor doesn't become just about how, you know, one border was made and crossed, because we've seen that over and over and over and over and over again, right? And I hope that in some way it shows how people have been kind of crossing all kinds of borders and remaking them at the same time, but not just like in one national border perspective. I mean, I love Peter Solon's work when it happened. It was a very, very important book. But then I kind of feel like I'm saturated with works that focus on a border and watch how people go across it, both in anthropology and history and sociology, and how people go across and remake that border by crossing it. And I want to see more, you know, diffuse travels, and I want the people who David was talking about, you know, this inspiration from to the people without history, like they've also been moving. So how can we find out more about those histories and the, you know, recent histories of those people who don't leave a lot of records, but cross borders a lot? I'd like to know the borders that they're crossing and how the creation of social boundaries for them between places happens. Like, those are the boundaries. How are those social boundaries made and remade anew and differently in other places? Like, that seems a very interesting question to me.
Matt, one of the other essays that you chose for this issue was Adam's wonderful essay on migrations, and he gave us a lot to think about mobility as a really a constant thread from our earliest history into the 21st century. With the global pandemic now, temporary global migration or tourism has stopped, just about stopped, which means it's gone from 1.5 or more billion international tourists annually to almost none.
Yeah, it's a really weird moment that I was organizing the issue, because the articles had all been selected by January, when I knew COVID in China. I teach history of disease, but I wasn't thinking what could happen. And I remember when I finally sat down to write the introduction in March, when I was actually in lockdown, I was thinking about how I picked this issue of migrations, and I started to remember I had a former colleague at Hawaii who works on the arrival of the airplane, which completely transforms the islands in a way that could not have been foreseen in the 1950s. Because of the, you know, mass mobilization, mass transportation. And so I think it's actually an interesting moment to be talking about migrations, to be talking about borders when, and, you know, I'm looking at the questions coming in, I'm thinking students in the fall, how interesting it is for them to confront the issues about what happens when borders close, when we don't have access. I'm listening to my students now complain about the problems that they can't get things at the store. And I was like, global supply chains. What an opportune moment to think about the way that the 20th century and the acceleration of transportation and migration transformed our lives. And I think it's a really interesting way of drawing on that experience that they would never have had and making it real for them. And so I think it's a good moment for us to be bringing these sorts of concerns about migration and the role of mobility and transportation into our classrooms. It's sort of broaching that big scale, small scale problem that we were talking about already. You know, you can take almost any incident from their daily lives now and turn that into the microhistory that lets them have some questions to think about what's happening with the world. And I think that's a really interesting way of approaching taking this issue into the classroom.
Yeah. In fact, we have a question from Sean Dry. With many of our courses going online and or remote in the fall, do the panelists have thoughts on how we can help our students engage with world history connections in that online environment, online learning environment? Certainly, you know, pointing to the global implications of many of the issues that are much closer to home, be they supply chains or protests in the street. You know, how are those connected? How are the Black Lives Matter protesters connected in the United States connected to those in London and Paris and Nairobi and all of the other global sites of protests that have emerged?
I think that's actually, I think the idea of information and how it flows through those chains actually becomes even more relevant at this moment in time. And I definitely think you could be drawing on that experience, talk about these same sets of issues. Partially because even while we're all in isolation, sitting in our own rooms on the Zoom board, we're still in conversation, we're still passing information, we're discussing these issues. And I think there's a way you can take that experience and bring it out to be talking about the bigger issues with global racism that we want to discuss and be bringing to our students.
I'm going to attempt to make a connection between the previous question and this one. I think the borders question. I think one of the most interesting things that's going on right now is a lot more people are working on the kind of global implications of their insights about regional formations. And they're particularly, I would signal sort of two types of analysis that I think are very interesting. One is analysis of regional formations, some of them micro-regional formations that have a kind of modular existence in world history. So a former student of mine, Yepa Molik, wrote an article about for example, imperial micro-regions, a region, that inter-imperial micro-regions, I should say, where there were a number of empires kind of clustered in a small place, often with one empire, the dominant force, and saw this as a kind of modular sort of formation that was recreated in multiple places around the world. So you get a kind of insight that way about global history. But then an equally interesting trend, I think, is towards the exploration of sort of quirky assemblages. So connections between places, either actual connections or analytical connections between and among places that are in very distant locations. There's been a resurgence, for example, of research on the Indian Ocean islands, particularly Mauritius and Bourbon, Réunion, and the Caribbean, and the connections between them, but also analytical connections that come up when one looks at archipelagos, as Jennifer's work does in Southeast Asia. So then the question about the current day is we've got some weird assemblages going on, right? If our students are going to come into the classroom interested in the politics of pandemic. And one of the things that we reach for, of course, is medical history, history of medicine. And we've all been consuming, I think, you know, these really interesting histories about Spanish flu and other past pandemics. And But another way of going at this is to tap into this very interesting tendency in world history to illuminate these synchronic kinds of formations where you know, things happen in similar ways in oddly placed and, you know, somewhat disjointed locations. So institutional change like the kind we're seeing in the US now, where some people are advocating this kind of hollowing out of the state, and there's this interesting debate kind of going on about whether this is fascism or not fascism, or proto-fascism, or the lead up to fascism. But of course, it is something new. It has fascist moments and aspects to it. There's no doubt about it. They borrow fascist symbols and themes all the time, but it is different because they don't want the trains to run on time. And there's no vision of kind of corporate vertical integration. There's an actual vision of a hollowing out of state, of the middle range of the state, with heightened power at the top. And that, where is that appearing? It's appearing in slightly weird, disconnected places. It may be appearing in more places than we know, but we do know Brazil, Hungary, you know, China may be actually a very good example here. So this is a kind of synchronic moment when we can begin to see some sort of shift. May it not be permanent, but certainly something that we can find, we can tell our students about in ways that do have historical precedents, even though they aren't exactly the same. They have analytical precedents.
I'd like to push that in a slightly different direction with this question from Carrie Ward. She says, Jennifer Gaynor's idea of nautical revolutions is really fascinating, and I'd like her to reflect on that beyond the scope of her article. But then she goes on to say, what do David and Lori think about the nautical revolution in conversation with the agricultural revolution? So,
should I start?
Want to tackle that?
I think there have been nautical revolutions.
Sorry.
Can you hear me? Oh, I'm not muted. I think there have been nautical revolutions in different times and places. I mean, I thought when I wrote that the other day, taking notes, I thought, do I want to do a book on nautical revolutions? And I thought, oh gosh, then I'd have to defend the idea. But I really do think that from my own work, I see how there are different formations, there are different political and social formations related to the coastal maritime world. And I've been involved in writing about this for different settings, but they come out of these very, very long histories of this maritime world before significant interactions from South Asia, and before any significant sort of travel from, you know, before Sung China, before 9th century China, there were already these, the polity formations. Lauren, you were talking about interpolity formations. There were polity formations happening through these nautical exchanges. And so, you know, these kinds of densely maritime you know, environments of human ecotone interactions, they don't just happen in Southeast Asia, but in Southeast Asia, I know that case best, and going way, way back to, you know, the beginning of the first millennium. And I see that they impacted the formation of politics and, you know, the ways, not just trade affected polities and the way these polities hooked up into, you know, more the development of long distance trade, but the kinds of political formations that developed are deeply maritime. So, you know, I'm hard pressed, Carrie, sorry, to pinpoint like, you know, 1, 2, 3 like specific nautical revolutions. I think it may be possible to sort of catch them through these efflorescences, but with these densely archipelagic areas where political formations and interactions between polities depended on mariners so heavily, I think that it impacted the formation of structures that cross the archipelago, social structures. and hierarchies, and forms of slavery kind of grew up in that, different kinds of forms of slavery. So I could say more about slavery, but I want to hear what Lauren and David have to say about the agricultural revolution and nautical revolutions, thinking those together.
Can I leap in with it's actually with a question, partly to you, Jennifer. If in response to Jonathan Reynolds' question, some of the borders that I'm keenest to push through are the chronological ones. I still think if you look at the Journal of World History, you'll find that the vast majority of its articles depend on written sources and are about the last 500 years. Humans have been around for 200,000 years. That always worries me. So I love the idea of a nautical revolution, but I've recently become aware, and this really is a question because I'm not sure I understand what I'm seeing here, but I think genetic evidence suggests that Australia was settled minimum 65,000 years ago, must have been settled by quite a large group of people. I think the genetic evidence suggests that. And so I've seen arguments that we must be talking 65,000 years ago about planned migrations, perhaps a bit like those that took humans into the deep Pacific, probably using bamboo craft of some kind. We have no archaeological evidence for this, so this is all guesswork. So is it possible there was a significant nautical revolution way back, 65,000 years ago? And the other aspect of that is the possibility that human migrations eastward from Israel took place over 100,000 years ago, but they were around coasts that were then buried. And that they too may have depended on the existence of significant nautical technologies. Now, this is all profoundly speculative, so that's why I say this is a question, really. What's your reaction to these ideas?
Mine? I mean, the early human migrations to Australia and the earliest ones to Southeast Asia took place at a time when their water level was much lower and the lands were, sure, the land was closer connected. So it's not, you don't need the fancy nautical technology to do it. But on the other hand, it seems like the old theories about people migrating down the peninsula into the island world for the slightly later migrations, those have kind of been bracketed and pushed aside by much more interesting things about the migration of people into, like, from Philippines, South China coast, going out into Micronesia, and then back into Southeast. And there's, I mean, I'm not the expert on this stuff, but I do have read some of these studies that look at different sources of genetic migration, and they're very, very interesting, and they suggest that nautical technology was, as you're trying to get at, a much more prominent feature in human migration than we want to grant. And for sure, Jim Delgado, the famous marine archaeologist James Delgado, has said, I'm trying to pin him down where he said it in publication, if anywhere, but he says in a lecture that's excerpted in a documentary that people, before there were villages, people were sailing. And I think that's food for thought.
Well, I have another question from this one from Angela Lee, who asks, how do the presenters find a personal connection with an intellectual interest in regions and time periods so different from their own, enough to make the studies a life pursuit? And I think there was a common theme that came out that world historians generally, and those assembled here today, have been very brave in moving out into fields, creating new fields, going out into fields that they weren't necessarily trained in, and with some pretty exciting results. What is it that makes us want to do that?
That's one of the borders I love I love to cross. It's the border that says, do not cross this because this is not where you were trained. Now, even if you weren't trained, you can ask interesting questions. And sometimes if the questions are focused enough, you can glom on to the scholarship in a neighboring discipline that is both accessible to a non-specialist and good. And I think that's what probably we spend a lot of our time doing. Certainly all three of us have done that. Yeah, it requires a bit of courage, but frankly, the courage is simply willingness to put up with flack from other scholars who either get territorial. I've been giving lectures on the Big Bang for years. The occasional astronomer says, well, where's your license, to lecture on the Big Bang? Well, I have no license at all, but there's a lot of very good popular science out there written by people who really do know what they're talking about. And someone like me can read it. So a lot of this, I think, is driven, and this is in answer to the question, a lot of this, I think, is driven by a fascination with the other, with what is not familiar. And I think the always astonishing discovery that when you look at what you think of as other, so often you stare at it long enough and you find it's not actually the other at all. It's part of what you are. And that for me is always kind of riveting when I find those synergies. When I realize that the energy processes that go on in the Big Bang have a hell of a lot to do with my own life, my own existence, with the project of sustainable development for humanity. So I think I was always discontented with the idea of staying within the borders of what I was trained in. If I'd done that, I would have become a scholar of change or lack of change in the Russian autocracy in the first 10 years of the 19th century. I might have made a small reputation in that field, but that didn't seem very exciting.
I'm fascinated by this because I feel like I have similarly transgressive impulses, but I've arrived at a completely different place. It's sort of like Japan sees itself as an island country and its archipelagos, and Indonesia sees itself as an island country. But Japan uses the idea of an island country to justify its sort of cultural, monotone similarity among everyone, whereas Indonesia uses the idea of being an island country to talk about its radical diversity. So, my attachment to my areas come from two places, and one is the experience of living in other cultures with completely different languages. First Finland, then long-term in Japan, and learning languages. My Finnish was never good, but my Japanese was very good. And living in another culture for a significant period of time and really learning the language taught me that the other is not just like me. I mean, in some ways, of course, but in other ways, no. And if you can't get your head into another language, if people don't learn other languages and live in other countries, you can't appreciate difference in that way. But the other thing that ties me to what I study is I think I must have been a fish in a former life. I just have a water fetish, and I love all things associated with the ocean. So I, found ways to learn how to sail and became a dive instructor, and just, you can't keep me out of the water. So I think this tied me to it, to have a research project that from Japanese women abalone divers, I went to Indonesia and found ways to investigate people who lived with the sea, and it opened other worlds for me, literally.
So I will just jump in very quickly to say that I'm a contrarian by nature, and a lot of the questions that I generate are just from skeptical reading. So I'll often find myself reading something and thinking, that can't be right. I don't think that's right. And I often don't have much of a basis for developing that hunch, but I do like to follow them up. And I find that those kinds of contrarian impulses often lead to interesting questions. And frankly, if you have an interesting question, you're always interested in the answer. So that's one thing. I've written articles based also on annoyance. I think annoyance is a pretty good motivating factor sometimes. You know, sometimes somebody just says something that you just don't think is right. And making sure that you can demonstrate that is not right takes you in, you know, sometimes farther than you want to go in some direction, but, you know, you get kind of stubborn about doing it. Having said all of that, I do regard myself as someone with a perspective. And I do have a kind of methodological perspective and also something of a theoretical perspective that continues to interest me. And I would describe it as coming out of social history and as relating with this to the kind of general problem of how order is created out of conflict, how conflict produces change. And so that's a kind of, you know, unoriginal perspective in some ways, and one that has been influenced a lot of other people and has also been theoretically quite developed. But I find it very generative. So there are lots of good questions to be asked and lots of contrarian impulses to be fed through that perspective. But I do find that sometimes I tell graduate students, I think it's worthwhile sort of thinking about what your intellectual perspective is that you're bringing, and then that adds a kind of consistency to the sorts of questions that you generate beyond just sheer annoyance.
Can I agree with the contrarianism? I think my own contrarianism was growing up in England with a very British centered sense of world history, growing up as a child as part of the empire, and during the Cold War, and learning from the media and from the sources that the Russians were bad people. And my teenage contrarianism was, I don't think I believe that every Russian is a bad person. I'd like to know more about this country. So and I eventually ended up living for a year as a student in the Soviet Union under Brezhnev, learning Russian and all the gains from soaking yourself in a culture that at first sight seems very, very different from yours. And of course, you don't just discover that they're the same as you. You discover that there really are differences, there are also similarities, but it's always incredibly exciting. But that for me was a sort of contrarianism. And the other was the one about, you know, you're a Russian historian, don't you dare go near Germany or India or whatever else it is. You don't have the license. So yeah, I think contrarianism can be a very powerful and useful motivator, particularly in a field like world history, which involves, you know, illegally crossing a few borders.
Yeah. A final point to piggyback on this conversation from Laura Mitchell. She notes that Jerry Bentley's last published statement on the field in 2011 argues that a defining aspect of world history is the goal of conceptualizing history that isn't grounded in either Europe or the nation. And, you know, obviously all three papers here do that work more or less intentionally. And specifically, she asks of Lauren Benton, your paper starts with ideas of European legal practices as a center point and puts African and Indigenous American legal practices on equal footing. 20 years on, do you see ways to think comparatively about legal history without starting in Europe? And I think you've kind of already answered that, but do you want to jump in?
Sure. Listen, I do think that is yeah, I mean, that has to do with this kind of interpolity focus that I was describing. I think that one can, begin to tell histories that in which Europeans may play very little or only marginal parts, and use many of the same approaches. I do want to say, though, that I continue to be a historian of European empires, and I do think they're pretty important. So I think that this is sort of part of my my answer to my exhortation to say that there are lots of ways of doing world history. I think that that one can be very attentive to the dangers of Eurocentrism and yet still have Europeans as a big part of one's focus. And in a way, I think that's been a good turn also in the field. I would say 10 years ago, there was a kind of reflexive anti-Eurocentrism. And then, in many ways, through the kind of imperial history that I've been alluding to, is also an effort to ask questions about European empires, that the questions themselves and the themes themselves belong to world historical frames. So it's a kind of provincializing of Europe, to steal that phrase. But I don't think one needs to necessarily turn away.
Unless one's looking at things before Europe was part of the picture. I mean,
Sure. No, it depends on the problem. It depends on the place. It depends on the questions that one's involved in.
Well, I think we can probably agree that world history does matter now more than ever. And Matt, I hope you'll keep us in the light of having opportunities to really share the special issue of the journal widely, and let people know about its availability through the month of September.
And at this point,
thank you.
At this point, I want to chime back in and thank everyone for participating in this session. All of the audience members. I want to particularly express the WHA's gratitude to David Christian, Lauren Benton, Jennifer Gaynor, Matt Romanello, and Candace Goucher for sharing their time and their expertise with us, and to the University of Hawaii Press for making the Journal of World History's 30th anniversary edition freely available to anyone who has an internet connection, not just WHA members, but the whole world. I hope this session has sparked ideas for your research and inspired thinking about how to incorporate these papers and ideas into your classes. I want to conclude by highlighting two upcoming events. Our next Under the Baobab gathering will be next week, Tuesday, July 28th at 4:30 Pacific, 7:30 Eastern Time. It's entitled Reframing Revolutions, Centering Indigenous, Black, and Women's Voices in the Age of Revolutions. And it is led by three WHA members, Eric Beckman, Bram Hubble, and Angela Lee. Information and registration is available on our website, thewha.org. And we also have 2 other Baobab sessions in the works. Secondly, I want to point out that the WHA is a partner in the upcoming Open Educational Resource Conference for Social Studies called the OC for Social Studies, which is sponsored by the same Gates Ventures folks who have supported David Christian and the Big History Project in the guise of their World History Project. This conference will unfold online August 5th, 6th, and 7th. It's an innovative platform to support elementary and high school teachers of history and social studies. Several WHA members are among the presenters and discussion leaders. And if you're curious, the keynotes are going to be by John Green of Crash Course fame, Teacher of the Year Nate Bowling, educational scholar Linda Darling-Hamill, Linda Darling Hammond, Yohura Williams, and Jill Lepore. A link to their website is available on the WHA's website in our announcements section. And so with that, we are exactly at 6 o'clock, according to my clock here on Pacific time. Thanks everyone for coming, and hope to see you all next week under the Baobab.